Well, I knew when it came to be about 8:30 and barely anybody was here, I said, yeah, this has got to be the day we start at 9:15. So, good to see everyone out. Let's have a word of prayer before we begin. Brother Ken, would you lead that prayer?
Father in heaven, we thank you for this time we can be together. We've done our best, I guess, to prepare our hearts for this, but we also need to have your help with this and you to come into our minds and recall to us the things we want to learn here and things we've done to learn. Anyway, we want to be your people and know of your things, and just bless this opportunity that we have here. And all glory to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So we're on page 66, starting lesson 16. And I again, just want to say how much I appreciate this book. There's so much review in it. It's very, very helpful. And it's helpful, too, that we don't have just the review sections. There are some lesson books that they're sort of written like, the previous lesson, lesson 15, but that's the whole book. It's all, fill in the blank stuff. I'm so thankful that there's such good information in this that's so helpful for us. And then we go through the review every other time. So Lord willing, we're going to be going through 16, 17 today, and then going through the review of that on Wednesday night, Lord willing, and go from there. But yeah, so when we look at further past the Exodus, and I know y'all reviewed it all on Wednesday, what were some of the most important things that happened as a result of the Exodus? Or what are some things that we kind of see that happened to the nation of Egypt? Sorry, go ahead.
The lack of faith of the Israelites.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a big consequence, which is kind of sad because they saw so much, didn't they? Mm-hmm. Brother George?
They saw the power of God.
They did. Okay.
Big time.
Yeah. So, absolutely. And they saw it. And one of the things that we see moving forward in the story is who else saw that? Who else knew about it?
Of course, the Israelites. And
the Israelites.
Nations round about heard about it.
Nations round about. And we're going to talk about that with Jericho. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, no, I was going to say Joshua and Caleb.
Oh, yeah.
They both saw it.
Absolutely. They were there. They saw it all. And so we talked about how that generation that was going to come to the Promised Land, what happened to them?
They died because they did not have faith in God.
Yes. When we talk about the wanderings in the wilderness, of course, it's not because they lost their way. It's go ahead, Ken.
I wanted to do this when you finished your point, but I'm kind of wondering if we see too much, we can't have faith. We'd rather see it than have faith. I don't know.
No, I don't think that's real. I think a lot of that has to do, in my thought, with just this aspect of the heart. Very often the Bible kind of shows us the condition of the heart really determines whether we have the faith that we ought to have, how open we are to the Lord. And I think what we find with Israel is that their immediate conditions were so overwhelming that they let that rob them of their faith in God. So they may have had, I tend to think while they're going through that Red Sea with the walls of the water on either side of them, I would imagine their faith it's got to be pretty good at that moment, right? You got to hope that this all stays up and it doesn't collapse on us. So there's a matter of fear there, but that faith overcoming that fear, because otherwise they wouldn't have even gone through. And so I wouldn't necessarily parallel it that way, but But I would say that we don't want to think it's the other way around, that I need to be able to see something to have faith. Because a lot of people think of it that direction. A lot of faith healers will kind of manipulate people from that perspective, and if something doesn't work right, then they'll say, well, there's not enough faith here, you know. So yeah, all of that is good. So they go up, and as we've talked about, this whole generation is going to die in the wilderness, not because God just wants them to die, not just because God is arbitrarily saying, okay, no, they don't get to go because I don't like the way they look. It is the lack of faith. Remember, the 12 spies go and spy out the land of Canaan. And what's their report?
Can't conquer it.
Can't conquer it?
They said there were giants somewhere.
There are giants there. We're like grasshoppers in their eyes.
Right.
And so what's fascinating about this too is that they had plenty of reason to believe that God would help them. And so, we kind of go back, and when we look at the tribes that are living in the land of Canaan, let's talk about the enemies that they would be facing. We're told about the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. It seems like the Amorites of these Canaanite tribes, Amorites seem to have been the most prominent, perhaps the largest. And the reason this helps us when we understand some later passages. Actually, what we're going to be looking at in the sermon today kind of parallels with this, because we're told that Ahab followed the ways of the Amorites and did all the abominations of the Amorites. Well, the Amorites by that time wasn't just talking about one tribe of the Canaanites. It was actually indicative of the whole of the Canaanites, because it's kind of like later on in the prophets when God addresses Israel and calls them Ephraim. The reason he calls them Ephraim is that Ephraim was the most prominent of the northern tribes. And so that's just the general notion we have there. So the Amorites, but back here, of course, we have them all listed. And when we look in chapter 1 of Joshua, that's what we see, is that this sense of conquering this place and to be strong and of good courage, to recognize that God is giving them this land. And there are also, as we mentioned, there are also giants there, called variously the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, or the Zamzumim. And so we want to understand, too, that the idea of giants is not this mythical idea. Yes, ma'am?
Are the Palestinians, are they descendants of any of those tribes?
So the Palestinians, that word Palestine, Palestinians, comes from Philistine. So it goes all the way back to the Philistines. If you remember, the Philistines were living in what region in the land of Canaan?
Coastal.
The coastal land. So as the land kind of, the coast, am I doing this right? Yeah. I'm trying to do it mirror. So as the land kind of curves against the Mediterranean, this coastal area, that's where the Philistines are. And so now what they call the Palestinians today, probably, I'm thinking generally would be a mix of various races that have just lived there for thousands of years. So you've got, in addition to that, you've got some aspect of the Samaritans, some aspect of the Philistines, and by now it's all so mixed that they really become a distinct people. And the only reason that the Israelites there, or the Jews there, are distinct is because most of them came from Europe anyway. So there's a racial distinction there. In fact, it's been said that the Palestinians over there today probably share more blood relation to first century Jews than the actual Israelites that transferred in there in the 40s, 50s, and so on and so forth, and 60s. So does that help a little?
Yes.
Yeah. So very good. So these tribes, of course, were descendants of Ham through his son Canaan. And someone remind me again, what happened? What did Noah pronounce upon Ham? A curse. Yeah. And it was cursed especially toward Canaan, right? I said he cursed Ham, but he cursed Canaan essentially for the sake of Ham. And said we remember while that happened. So these people lived closely with the descendants of Shem in the Fertile Crescent and in Arabia, so all kind of spread out. The name Canaanite, of course, is used most frequently in a collective sense with all these tribes, especially early on. But as I say, by the time you got a later approximation of this in the time of the kings and the divided kingdom, the term Amorite, I think, is used to generally look at them because of the prominence of the Amorites. And I think there is a sense of singling them out for their distinct wickedness. You remember back when God said that the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet complete. God was going to let them continue to fester, essentially, in their sin before he punished them. And so, as I said, Amorites were the largest and strongest. And this, again, helps us understand something. They're concerned because there are giants in the land, but the Israelites conquered two groups of Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan before Moses died, Sihon and Og. And as we remember, anybody tell me how long was Og's bed?
13 feet.
About 13 feet and I think 9 feet wide.
6 feet.
6 feet wide, yeah. So that sounds like a giant to me.
Yep.
The Bible doesn't outright say that, but and it's fascinating too when you get to the time of Goliath, where they're so terrified of this 9-foot guy. But apparently there was this guy that was at least 12 feet at some point. So and they conquered them handily. We learn about the Hittites, who were descendants of Canaan through his son Heth. And we've talked about their early kingdom along the Halys River, and that's up in north of Israel, right? In Asia Minor. So you've got the curve of the Mediterranean going up this way, and then up in that region, we've got the early Hittite kingdom. And these Hittites would actually spread throughout the area. Of course, we remember Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah from a Hittite. So that's an interesting aspect there. You also have the Hivites, the Girgashites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. And we see those listed very often, don't we? But these were smaller and less powerful tribes. And the Jebusites, their stronghold was the city of Jerusalem. So isn't it fascinating, by the way, that Jerusalem is such an ancient city and an old city. And yet that's the one that David later conquers and makes the city of David. Yes, sir.
The blessing that Abraham received from the king of Salem, Melchizedek, well, that was that region too.
Yes, yeah. And I think Salem in that passage is thought to be an early version of saying Jerusalem. So yeah. Jerusalem. So yeah, very good. So, but they proved difficult to dislodge. They proved problematic in this early point. But we remember, again, the giants in the land before Abraham's day. I mentioned before I got to this slide, Og's bed. Of course, Goliath was 9.5 feet tall. Let's talk about the spies in chapter 2. They send spies across the Jordan to the city of Jericho, right? And that's our first, I believe, fill in the blank here up on the top of page 67. I want us to turn to Joshua chapter 2 and see what we learn about what the people are saying. And remember Rahab?
Oh, yes.
What genealogies do we find Rahab in?
Christ.
Mm-hmm.
She's the mother of Boaz, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So that whole progression is there. And so I think that it is very important that we see that these are people who are Gentiles. But look at Rahab's opinion of the Lord. We start in verse 9. Verse 9. where Rahab says, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you my kindness, that you will also show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all they have, deliver the last from death. Rahab finds salvation from the destruction of Jericho through the children of Israel. There's a lot of reverberations in that and parallels when you think about it. That, yes, sir.
Well, my lesson touched on that particular about Rahab. To make a correction, I got there and said I thought it was Joshua and Caleb that were the 2 spies that went in the second time. That the Bible doesn't name the men. They're 2 young men, but they were evidently squared away. Joshua wouldn't send them in there. They were just 2 young men.
There you go. So, all right, so they learn that the people are terrified. And so the Israelites are able to move forward. They're confident of success. They cross the Jordan, and where do they camp? Gilgal. And that's going to be where they're camping for a little while as they do this. So Jericho is the logical place to attack first. It's right in the path between their camp and the central portion of the land that they're supposed to take. And they march around the city, don't they? And they march around the city how many days? 7. And the walls fell flat. Remember, in the 7th day, they had to march around another 7 times. And then they blew their trumpets and the wall fell down. I've seen artist renditions of the walls being really aspects of just sort of, I don't want to say pyramids, but sort of angular shaped. And so the fact that they fell down, first of all, is pretty impressive. But number 2, there is some archaeological evidence, if I remember correctly, that those walls did fall inward and not outward. And so that's pretty fascinating.
About the Hittites, for many years they said the Hittites didn't exist. But guess what? They did some geological studies and found where the Hittites had been.
Yes, sir. So Jericho was the first city in Canaan proper to fall. And so then, where did they send spies? Toward Bethel and Ai. Yeah, they toured Bethel. They returned, and they said, well, yeah, we can take Ai. That's not a problem. And then they send a small company, don't they? If you think you can take it easily, I mean, Jericho must have been a big city. And then they said, well, we don't really need that many to take Ai. What happened to them?
They got whooped.
Yep. 36 of their men died and they fled. And we remember what God said, I'll be with you if you obey my commandments. So the fact that they lost told them something about how they were faithful to God or not. And this is very basic. And of course we talk about with the book of Job, that just because something bad happens to you or because you lose at something doesn't always mean that you're against God. But in this scenario, everything is so basic that, Joshua is trying to figure out, he's actually interviewing people one by one, groups by group seemingly, to kind of go through, well, what exactly happened? And they find sin in the camp. And Achan, of course, was stoned for his sin. And the reason for that is because he took from God's stuff, the things that belonged for him. And so we don't have time to go deep into that. But the people prepare for battle again. And once the sin is removed, they had no trouble defeating Ai nor Bethel. And then Ai was burned and left as a permanent heap. This is pretty steady across the board. God has no tolerance for these people, which tells us something about what they were doing and who they were. People talk about this time and act like, well, this was just a genocide and God was just authorizing a genocide. In reality, God was cleansing the land of the people that had really defiled it over time. And so he knew what the right time was. And so they go through Jericho, Ai, and Bethel, and then they're able to move freely into the hill country. They go to the Twin Peaks of, and it's in middle of page 67 of, absolutely. They're at Shechem. It's a pretty important place, isn't it? And we go back to think about how this was the first place that Abraham camped, right? And this is the first in Canaan, I mean. And it's also the first place where he promised to give the land to his descendants. He received the land promise in Genesis 12. So again, Shechem is a very important spot. And even as you go through the Bible, it becomes very important from that perspective. Men from Gibeon came, and what did they do?
They made out like they weren't Canaanites. That they made an agreement. The Israelites made an agreement with the Gibeonites because the Gibeonites had deceived them.
Mm-hmm.
God, one of the things God told them not to do was to make any alliance with anybody.
Right. And so, obviously, and we point out that if you're going to point out one of the big flaws of Joshua is here, right? This mess up, this mistake, I would say. I would call it a mistake. He didn't inquire about this from God. So that's a big issue here. But of course, we can recognize why Gibeon did that. You know, they're hearing of all this destruction in all these other places, and better to make peace than to try to just withstand this army that's just marching through unopposed. And then Joshua and the Israelites, they accept them, but of course, that leads to other further problems. We also see this ruler that we're introduced to, the king of Jerusalem, Adoni-Zedek. He's upset over Israel's victories, and he especially is concerned when he hears about the peace between Gibeon and Israel. So in his mind, well, they're banding together, they're making friends here, this is going to be awful for us. And so what does he do? Yeah, he calls upon 4 kings to help him. He makes a little alliance. The kings of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. And I did want to notice on the map that we're using for this lesson, map number 6, they actually, I didn't see Lachish on this map. So you might note where that is, but it's a little crowded anyway. There is a Laish up in the northern part of that map on page 56, but it's not the same place. Lachish is where it is right up there on the map. You can see in that region, which makes sense. I mean, these are people that are toward the south. He's going to call upon them. And remember, where was their entry point? How did they enter the land? Did they come from the south? Which direction was their entry point?
From the east.
From the east, yes, from the Jordan.
Yeah.
So they're going this way. So those southern kingdoms, they haven't torched them yet, right? Yeah, so that's what's happening is he's calling for help from these other regions. And so they go and they attack Gibeon. And Gibeon sends for help from Joshua. And so the Israelites make a surprise attack on the armies. And then the Amorites are fleeing toward Beth-horon, Azekah, and Makkedah. We find in this passage as well that God sent a hailstorm that killed more than the battles that Joshua had done against them. So Joshua is kind of taking the battle to them. He's kind of routing them out. He's taking this opportunity to go and push hard to eliminate them. And what happened? What did God bring about for one day so that he could keep killing these people?
Stop the sun.
Stop the sun.
Which means he stopped the earth from rotating.
Yeah, it seems like that's likely what may have happened. It's however he did it, however he accomplished that, that's what God did. And it gave them enough time because nighttime would have allowed for them to escape likely. and it would have been much harder to hunt them down.
That's, you might call that first day on the second time.
Well, possibly.
That's one way to look at it.
So while Joshua had the advantage, he pushed through all the major cities of the south. He killed 5 kings in Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Gezer, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir. So he goes through all these regions. You can see in the map right there, all the places where he's going right there. And again, you can see where Lachish and Debir are, which those, again, are not on the printed map, and they're on that original map that I'm working with the PowerPoint here. But he added those so we know where those seemingly were. Any questions? So the campaign moves to the south, and then so we have a coalition of the south. Now we have a coalition of the north forming. They haven't been there yet, and it's led by Jabin, the king of Hazor. And you can see where Hazor is. It's up right to the west of the kingdom of Og, up in Bashan. Remember when Amos talked about the cows of Bashan, cows of Bashan?
Yeah.
That's that region. That's still known. Even in the time of the divided kingdom, that was known as Bashan, even though it was in the land of Israel at that time. So it's led by Jabin, king of Hazor, and he gathers a large army from the northern third of the land, and he assembled where?
Waters of Merom.
The waters of Merom. And so they strategize against Israel. And Brother Waldron has some breakdown here about early scholars thought it was Lake Hula, but now it's more generally thought to have been located on a plain southwest of Hazor, about halfway between Lake Hula and the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Chinneroth as it's used in this passage. So don't be confused. When you see Sea of Chinneroth, that's the Sea of Galilee, but that's what it's called later on. Remember, we're talking about Moses using the names of his day, that, and I say Moses, but Moses and the authors, seemingly Joshua, would have used the names of their day to refer to these lands. So again, we want to keep that in mind, because they don't just stay the same names forever. As they say in the song, Istanbul was once Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. So this huge army gathers at the waters of Merom, but there Joshua attacked and defeated them, and they fled northward. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think they probably got ideas from them back in those days to change all those names to what they are today?
I don't know. That's a good question. I
wonder.
wouldn't really know. Yeah. Yes, sir.
It's part of that strategy that to the winner go the spoils.
Mm.
Name it what you want to name it.
Yeah, that's true.
Is what I've seen.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. So like, and we talked about early on with the land of Canaan, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem, that was really where it would really begin to be called Assyria Palestina. And that's where Palestine kind of took over as a term to talk about that land. Yes, sir.
That's talking about Bashan, the Messianic prophecy, and what is it? Psalms 22 uses that term about the strong bulls of Bashan surrounding them.
Yes.
Bashan, I mean, it was mentioned well a bunch of times.
Mhm.
Around so many different times. The prophets talked about Ezekiel,
Mm-hmm.
Micah, and of course you said Nahum, Zechariah, all of them talked about Bashan.
Yeah. So Joshua comes back. He takes the city of Hazor, and isn't it generally so interesting that the plans of these people who are enemies of God's people, not only do their plans fail, those plans took them away from their cities. And now Joshua can come back. And a conquest that might have been more difficult had Jabin just holed up in Hazor and built up his forces there. No, they go and they take Hazor. And Waldron talks about how Hazor was likely one of the biggest cities in the land. And it had walls around 200 acres, the Bible tells us. So a major conquest. They kill the inhabitants, they burn the city, and after the victory in the north, there's no king or coalition of kings left to fight Israel. So the power base of this area has been completely obliterated. And it's all happened through the Word of God. It's through His Word, and it's through the faith of the people following Him. Again, I think we've talked about this before, how we talk about the greatest generation, and people use that to talk about okay. I figured something was
People
happening
out
here.
of the time of the whole stock market depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a term used for them too.
Yeah, so they suffered through a lot, and then they fought a war and things like that. But in terms of the Bible, we recognize that, in a sense, this was the greatest generation of Israelites.
Yeah.
It's important to note that and to see that. And so that leads us to the land promise being fulfilled. Any questions about Lesson 16 before we go into Lesson 17? Any thought? Yes, sir.
Stephen, I think it might be important to notice here that one of the things that God specifically despised about these people was that they caused their children to go through fire for their gods. And that evidently became worse between the time of Abraham and this time we're talking about now.
Yes.
Wonder what's going to happen when God punishes us. That's got to be one of the major things that He is holding against us right now.
Sure.
And when does our day come that He'll no longer tolerate it?
Romans 2, you're treasuring up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath. Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And so as you bring that up too, the Bible will say that they cause their children to pass over the coals. That's not like, sometimes we see people kind of walking over coals as some kind of big thing. No, that's not what they were doing. What they were doing, they would build a fire, and they would place a bronze statue that's hollow inside of whatever god they're worshiping, Milcom, Chemosh, and Baal, and that statue would have outstretched arms.
Yeah.
And as that fire burns, that gets red hot, that statue, and they lay their children in the arms of Baal. They lay their children in the arms of Milcom and other.
King Manasseh was the worst of the bunch.
Yeah. So think about the horror of that. And I think it's important that we understand that, and I'm not getting into things that we can't know about, but I think we know just by law of averages, Satan hasn't stopped in that. And there are horrible things that people do today in the name of ritualistic religion or whatever they want to call it in their minds. And so we're not going to spend our time thinking about that. But I'm just saying, though, that hasn't stopped. But it helps us to understand. This was the same attitude back then. So don't ever have any sympathy or pity for these people. I'm not going to have any sympathy or pity for these people. God knew who deserved mercy or not. People say, well, what about the women and the children and people who are innocents in it all? God's got it handled. God's got it taken care of. And those children that died in these conflicts, God took care of them. And you got to ask yourself, what would be the worst scenario? Would it be better for them to just be abducted by Israel and try to be raised as an Israelite and possibly harbor bitterness against the people that killed their family and slayed all their, or is it better for those children to just literally be in heaven in the kingdom with God? That's how I view it personally. So I think any kind of accusation of this was genocide and blah, blah, blah. I think we need to go back and think about, why did God do this and what were the people doing there? Because that's where the blame lies. Very, very good point. I appreciate that. Anything else? Well, the land promise at the latter half of Joshua is fulfilled. We go through and we think about the 12 sons of Jacob. And Waldron makes a good comment at the top of page 69. He talks about how it's easy to determine the general location of each tribe, but determining the exact border lines is the hardest question of all the Bible geography. Because you can kind of follow what it says, but they didn't have any surveyors out there. And they didn't kind of map it out beforehand. They kind of determined it that way. And of course, we're going to talk about some of those details and some of those aspects there as we keep moving along. But the sons of Jacob through Leah were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Then, of course, Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin. Bilhah gave him Dan and Naphtali, and Zilpah, Gad, and Asher. Joshua 12 is the summary of all the cities Israel has conquered. It includes the territory on both sides of the Jordan. So we have regions focused there, and you can see he's highlighting the Jordan right there. We need to be able to identify the Jordan. That's a very big help to us to determining where other places are. And Joshua is told to divide the land between the tribes, and he would help each tribe finish the task of clearing its possession. It's fascinating to me. It was up to each tribe. It wasn't that the whole of the land necessarily at this point. It's not the whole of the people would go through and storm every little place. Because, why is that? Well, they had already knocked out the kings. All the powers, all the centers of authority there. And so what do you have then? You have smaller tribes that might present some resistance. But if you had a faithful heart like Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, you're willing to take on the sons of Anak and to say, no. I've been given this inheritance by God. I'm going to go fight for it. And there's some beautiful parallels there as children of God today, as followers of Christ, that we do have an inheritance in the gospel, and we do need to fight for it sometimes. And so there's an aspect there to consider. And so again, as I said, you can determine the location, but it's hard to figure out the border lines. And most maps are kind of different in the way they draw all those out. But the tribes asked for specific cities in particular sections of the country. And I think it's important, as he says, that our faith is not on how they accomplish this or whether they accomplish this. Our faith is on the Word of God. A brother told me one time, it's like, well, they didn't really conquer all the land. The land promise wasn't really fulfilled because they didn't conquer all the land. And my answer is, well, whose fault was that? Was that God's fault or their fault? God fulfilled everything he said. So we have to believe what the text is telling us. That's what it's all about. And we can make our little nitpicky kind of, well, he didn't really give them all. No, he did. But it was just up to them. They had to go and conquer it. And the tribes that are left were left because the Israelites didn't conquer them. Yes, sir.
You know, it's remarkable when you look at it. Anybody's ever seen the movie Exodus? They sing the title song, God gave this land to me. It's in that music. But see, they focused on that, but they never focused on what else was said, especially what God said about it.
Yeah.
If they didn't obey him, he would take all that away from them.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. All right, let's identify the following places here because we're told to label these on our maps, so we want to kind of try to figure out where these all are. We've got our list right here, and somebody tell me, if you can, just briefly. It's kind of hard, I guess, but where's the Dead Sea?
Far south end of the Jordan.
South end of the Jordan, very good. So there you have it right there. And then the Mediterranean Sea.
Far left.
Far left. Sea of Chinnereth.
West. It's at the very top, I guess, of Jordan or somewhere.
Yeah, it's where the Sea of Galilee is going to be later, isn't it?
Yeah.
Jordan River.
Straight down
Straight down the center, right?
And
How about the Zered River? Bottom right hand. We have 4 rivers that are east of the Jordan and east of the Dead Sea. So the Zered is at the bottom there. What's north of that? The Arnon. And then north of that is the Jabbok River. And then north of that is the Narmuk River. And of course, these are all labeled, so it should be pretty easy for us. Where is the inheritance of Reuben?
It's on the east side of the Jordan,
Mm-hmm.
and so is Gad and half
Yep,
the
there
tribe
you
of
go.
Manasseh.
So you got Reuben and Gad, and we can kind of see all of that right there. Then you have Manasseh, which is divided, right?
There's half the tribe.
Half tribe is on the eastern side, half of the tribe is on the western side. And it's a lot of land devoted to Manasseh, isn't it? Seems like a lot of big plots up there.
But that's got a lot.
Yeah. And then Simeon. Where's Simeon? The south on the eastern on the western side, right, of the Jordan. Then Judah is right above them. I think we all kind of know where Judah is. And then Benjamin is kind of tiny, isn't it? But it's right above Judah. And remember, by the time of the divided kingdom, Benjamin is kind of consumed by Judah. And so it's just kind of part of the land there, even though they're still a distinct tribe. So, and then Ephraim is north of that. We're kind of moving north here. Dan, right there to the west of Ephraim. Issachar, far to the north of there. We're getting up into the hill country now. Zebulun, just north of Issachar. Then Asher, which is up in that region. And keep in mind, you have Tyre in that region. So Asher would have access typically, if they had any control over those coastal cities, they'd have access to those coasts. And then Naphtali is right there as well, up in that hill country of Galilee, later called Galilee. And remember, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh asked for territory east of the Jordan before Moses died. And remember, Moses is concerned they're not going to help take the land of Canaan, but they promised to do so, and they follow through with it. And so Reuben is given a portion next to Moab. Gad received the land taken from Sihon, Manasseh from King Og. And Judah was the first tribe to ask for territory. And that really meant that they got a lot. They're given all the land west of the Dead Sea, south to the Negev. And so it's fascinating. The city of Hebron is given specifically to Caleb. So you got all this region here, and that's devoted to that. And then, of course, Ephraim asks for the central portion of the land, along with the half-tribe of Manasseh. And Joshua describes those borders of Ephraim in chapter 16. Let's look over there in Joshua 16. Joshua 16, somebody read 5 through 8, please. Joshua 16, 5 through 8.
And the border of the children of Ephraim, let me make sure I've got Joshua.
You got it. Yes, ma'am. You're right there.
When you said read what?
5 through 8.
Okay. And the border of the children of Ephraim according to their families was thus. Even the border of their inheritance on the east side was unto Bethel-ron upward. And the border went out toward the sea to, I can't pronounce all these things,
That's okay.
on the north side, and the border went about eastward unto Tanna, and passed by it on the east of Janohah.
Very good.
And it went down from Janohah to Ataroth to Napper, and into Jericho, and went out to Jordan.
And he says the border went out from Tappuah westward to the brook Kana and ended at the sea. This was the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Ephraim according to their families. And so you've got that breakdown there. So those borders of Ephraim are pretty interesting. Waldron has something to say about that, about how it's very different in different regions, and different maps kind of show this differently. In fact, they'll show Manasseh's tribe, and you might note here, let me get this laser pointer out. So if you look here, you can kind of see the land dipping down over in this region. So some people kind of give that land over to Manasseh, but nobody's really sure. Like from Adaroth to the Jordan there's just no designated place of where that border is. But what Waldron talks about, I'm looking at the top of page 72, he talks about that land is kind of unusable. It would have been very craggy and very, steep land. So it wouldn't have been land that really anybody wanted. It's kind of like you buy a property that's on a cliffside, and you may have 2 or 3 acres there, but you can't do anything with it. And so, unless you want to maybe build up like a little skyline or whatever. But there's just not really much to do with it. So those little nuances, I think, are really interesting for us to note and see that's why you have these maps look different, and to research that and to look at it. Again, I want to stress here, Brother Bob and Sister Sandra wrote this before ever going to Israel. They found all this out through research. And, Brother Jeremy's mentioned that it was likely Miss Sandra that found the most out, or at least was the most helpful in putting it all together. At least he said that in general terms. But regardless, I think this is why material like this is just so very helpful for us. So the men reported that Judah's portion is too large, and so Simeon, that's why Simeon shares this lot, and they share the territory with Judah. And then Dan and Benjamin are given territory between the tribes of Ephraim and Judah. Asher is given the narrow coastal plain of the north, and Naphtali receives the lot between lying farthest north along the banks of the upper Jordan. Zebulun and Issachar receive a healthy portion of the Jezreel plain and the hills and valleys of lower Galilee, which would have been a very rich place to farm and to use. So then we have Levi, right? What piece of land did Levi get? None. In fact, the Bible tells us that their inheritance is the Lord, right? And that relationship with Him, that's what's important. And you know what? There's so many beautiful parallels here. What are we as New Testament Christians? We're priests. We're priests. In many ways, we are Levites already in that sense. And what do we sing in that song? This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. I don't really, I can own land, I can own property here, but I better not stake my claim here, because I want to be in that heavenly country. I want to be living with the saints in eternity. And so I think that aspect of the Levites not having land, I think that sets up a whole lot for us to understand and appreciate about the rest of the Bible. But they weren't given lands, but they were given cities. 48 cities scattered throughout the land. Why do you think they were scattered throughout the land? Why didn't they just find one city where all the Levites could live?
One idea is people had to go to them to be protected in case, say, I'm trying to think of what it's called.
The Avenger of Blood.
Accidentally kill somebody.
Right.
You can go there and be protected.
Yeah, as Murphy just said, as to be safe from the Avenger of Blood.
There were cities of refuge.
Yeah, and that's the thing. All these 48 cities were not specifically cities of refuge. There was a smaller amount. 6 of those cities were cities of refuge. But you have 48 cities spread out, which again tells you but I think the access to the Levites, the access to the priest was important. Yes, sir.
The Levites were also the government.
Yeah, in a sense.
You had, legal problems,
Yes.
land disputes, whatever. You went to the Levite for resolution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And not all Levites were priests, but all priests were Levites, and so you got that distinction there. But it does remind me that when the man of God visits King Asa, I think it's in the Chronicles, where he says something to the effect of, the land has been without teaching priests for a long time. And so that tells you something, that the priests were supposed to have some aspect of their work to sort of be like, as you would think of maybe even a traveling evangelist today, to go around and to teach people what God's word said and to encourage them to do right. Yes, sir.
What about a local synagogue? You know, Paul talked extensively about local synagogues.
Yes.
Would that have been the Levites?
I don't know that the Levites would have been specifically involved with that, because I think they would have been involved with it for sure, but I think mainly as children of Israel. Because by the time you have the synagogue system come in, you've got people spread out throughout all these countries in the dispersion of the Jews after the exile, after the captivity in Babylon. And I don't believe that the synagogue system was explicitly tied to the Levites, except in the sense that you would have the priests working, but I think it was really more tied to the Sanhedrin. And to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you didn't have to be a Levite. I think you could be from various tribes. That was sort of the governmental body by the time you got to the first century. But that's a really good question, because the synagogue system became kind of the go-to for every Sabbath worship for the Israelites. But in this time, they didn't have the synagogues. That didn't come until after the return from captivity.
I'm wondering, did the prophets take the place of the Levites in the sense that any kind of, well, Jehoshaphat wanted to have a man of God come when he was helping Ahab.
Right.
And is that possible? The prophets took up the duty of doing that?
No, I think they shared that. Sure. Yeah. But there would be, unless that prophet was a Levite, then there wouldn't be any sacrifices he would offer or things like that. But I think you got a point there that the prophets were simply doing what God said. And while we see various times where the Levites actually do the right thing, remember when Jeroboam took the northern kingdom of Israel into this messed up system that supposedly worshiped God, but not the way that he had said. You remember how the Levites, they went back to the kingdom of Judah. And so at that point, they did the right thing. That doesn't mean they did it all through, but that's why Jeroboam started pulling priests from every walk of, every kind of tribe. For whoever wanted to be a priest could be a priest. So those are all really good questions. So it is interesting. These refuge cities were located so as to be only a day's journey from any point in the land. So that's really fascinating to me. I understand in Sweden, wherever you are, you're at least, I guess probably, I don't know what the range would be, but I've heard that basically wherever you are in Sweden, you can make it to a nuclear fallout shelter very quickly. They're spread out throughout the land, very easy access, which is fascinating on a couple of different levels there. But I think about that as like a modern parallel to this access to these cities of refuge and the closeness that the priest should have been. And again, that's where I say, when the man of God tells Asa it's been a long time since there have been teaching priests. It tells you the priests hadn't been teaching. They hadn't been doing what God said. So let's talk briefly about the fact that we have 13 tribes and only 12 sons. How do we get 13 tribes out of that? We remember that. Oh, go ahead.
No. Jacob or Israel adopted Joseph's two kids, probably to give him the equivalent of the birthright.
Yes, Joseph received the double portion,
Right.
as and he wasn't his firstborn, but he gave that to him, which again, that's sort of a distinction between Israel and the rest of the nations of the world. The nations of the world is typically, whoever the oldest son is, he gets first take. But yeah, Jacob's oldest son, Reuben, sinned. Jacob chose to give the birthright to Joseph. And that goes back, and you can read that in 1 Chronicles 5. Our time is kind of pulling short here. But instead of naming Joseph as one of the tribes, his two sons equally inherited, Manasseh and Ephraim. And again, remember, Canaanites were still living in the land, but God has already promised to help his people finish driving them out. They just had to have faith. And that's what Joshua called for at the end of the book. It called them together before he died, urged them to be faithful, that he had given them all the land that he had promised. And 2 of the promises of Abraham are fulfilled by the end of the book of Joshua. His descendants are a distinct, separate nation. They're living in a land of their own, Canaan. And so, again, I want to stress the Jews today do not need to inherit the land because that land has been fulfilled. That promise is done. And as we mentioned earlier, the people, fleshly Israel, they forsook the Lord. And they didn't remain faithful to him. So the land was taken from them. And now, people call it the Holy Land. And I think the only way we could call it the Holy Land is that, yes, at one point God had separated that land out and had given it in this promise. But there's nothing inherently holy about that land. There's nothing inherently mystically special about that land of Israel, except that this is where God chose to bring his people to give them to inherit. And so even though we see no inherent specialness of that land today, we can appreciate its significance historically, and especially to the people of God. Any other thoughts or questions today? I appreciate the good attention, the good discussion. All right, thank you so much.